It's fine. It's not like I do AV or anything. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thanks very much for coming to Beyond Sunday. As you know, it's a... Oh, wow, that is quite a shirt, Katie, just to call you out. Loving that. Let's all make it all about Katie. Okay, I will speak a bit slower because we're getting an echo. As you know, we've just had harvest, so we're thinking about giving generally. So this segues nicely into this evening's topic of, well, you'll find out. But we're delighted to be joined by Sarah, who's come to us from JustMoney movement. And I'll hand over to her in a second. Just to say, I don't currently have any more events planned. So what I thought I would do is do another little survey. I'm going to pass around pieces of paper. If you have any thoughts of what sort of topics you might want to address, parts of the Bible you might want to study, anything like that, can you jot them down? We will have pauses for questions and discussion throughout, but I'll let Sarah lead on that. And I think you all know where, donation points and fire exits and this sort of thing are, as most of you are regulars, so I won't go through that. But yeah, take it away, Sarah. Do you want to...
That will just make Evening, everyone. It's really nice to be here. As Rachel said, I'm Sarah Edwards, and I'm the director of the JustMoney movement. I'm going to talk you through some stuff this evening around money, how we can think about it theologically, biblically, and then very practically, what does that actually look like? So before we get started, a little bit about the organisation, which you may well not have heard of. The JustMoney movement is an ecumenical charity. We work across the Christian church denominations, and we help individuals and congregations to think about their faith, their values, and their financial choices. Can you still hear me if I stand here? Is it echoey? Okay. And so, there are two main ways that we work. One is to help people think about their own choices with money as individuals and as churches, and that's mostly what we'll be talking about this evening. And the other thing we do is campaigning, so enabling people to speak up for change in the way that businesses and banks and the tax system operate. You can always ask me questions about that if you're interested. All of which we want to do to help shape a fairer, greener world. I'm going to use the tech. So before we dive in, turn to the person next to you and just for a couple of minutes reflect on this topic of money, of what we do with our money, what sparks your interest in this subject, and what do you treasure? What's important to you? So just turn to the person next to you, or take a couple of minutes to reflect by yourself if you want to, and then just in pairs reflect for a couple of minutes on those two questions. Okay, I'm going to bring us back together now. Would anyone, you don't have to, but would anyone like to share anything that you've been talking to your neighbour about? Either what is it that sparks your interest in this topic, or what do you treasure? What is most important to you? Would anyone like to feed back? Yeah. Yes, please do speak into the mic.
Anyone? Yeah, right, you're big.
Hello. So Nicola and I both share very little interest in money. And what we were discussing was how it's important to be educated and to inform ourselves about what our money is used for, because if we remain ignorant, we compared it to, fair trade and ethical shopping. If you don't inform yourself about the ways in which you impact the world without knowing, then you're not leveraging the power you do have to change things for the better.
Fantastic, thank you. Anybody else want to come in?
But it is nothing really to do with money, because I didn't buy them and I can't.
Okay. Just everyone, if you can hold it. Is this not working?
Oh, is that working again now? It's working again now. Perhaps it's just when Nick's not in the room. Okay, I will try and use the mic because we're recording this evening, aren't we, as well? Fantastic. Really, really helpful, because I think the reality is, we're not really interested in money, are we, exactly? And many of us don't want to talk about money. We don't want to think about money. It's something that's a bit of a taboo, actually, in our society. We don't like to ask each other about money. We don't really want to have teaching in church about money. All of those things are just something that we don't want to engage with. And yet, if we care about the natural world, if we care about our communities, if we care about our families and the planet that our children and grandchildren will inherit, we have to think about money. We need to think about money and finance and the economy and the way in which the world is shaped. We have to inform ourselves and understand the way that our money is shaping a world for better or worse, and what can we do about it. That's the challenge. That's what we're trying to do this evening. So there are all kinds of Christian attitudes to money. Money, says John Wesley, is an excellent gift of God, answering the noblest ends. In the hands of his children, it is food for the hungry, drink for the thirsty, raiment for the naked. So that's your kind of stewardship campaign. What can we do with money? What can we do for good to serve the church's mission, to further the kingdom with the resources that we need? Or, says St. Paul, the love of money is the root of many kinds of evil. What are all the wicked and awful and greedy and corrupt things in the world that are to do with money? And finally, last but definitely not least, Jesus says, no one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money, or as it's often translated, mammon. So there's all sorts of different perspectives that we can have on money. what I want us to focus on this evening is this idea of what it is that we treasure and whether we can align our money with what that is. Because often, as we've said, that's not money. We treasure our families, we treasure our communities, we treasure being in nature, we treasure time with our loved ones. But how can we line up our money with those things? If we seek to follow God, he has our hearts. Does he have our money also? So to start off with a few principles, and then I'll get us to have a bit more of a discussion time. For us, we're really saying that relationship is at the heart of our faith, the outworking of our church life, our community life, and money and the economy link us to other people. So what do those relationships that actually might be quite hidden, what do those relationships look like? And what we're also saying is that God cares about how we use, spend and share money. So as I say, what or who do we treasure or value? And when we're thinking about, perhaps you've had a giving campaign in your church, thinking about what you can give to the church, that's really important, and a lot of it's rooted in the same principles that I'm going to be talking about this evening. But what about the rest of our money? So the money that we give away, we might think, well, that money's doing good. The rest of it just kind of sits in the bank, doesn't it? But does it? The money in our bank accounts, the money if we have some savings, if we're fortunate enough, the money that we spend on everyday purchases. What about that money, and how can that money have a positive impact? How can that money help to shape a society that's more aligned with God's kingdom values, with the foundational verse of the Just Money movement, actually? What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God, which is Micah chapter 6, verse 8. How can our money line up with those sorts of values? So, if you can, in perhaps groups of 3 or 4, just turn round to one another and have a bit of a think about what attitudes or values about money have you heard or observed in church settings? What themes or teachings can you think of in the Bible to do with money? And how might those compare or contrast? So just to get you going, we've already been talking about maybe the attitude is we're not interested in money. We don't want to think about money. That might be one. Whereas actually you might be able, if you start to look at it, to think of lots and lots of encounters and stories in the Gospels about money. So let's just spend a few minutes seeing if you can think of, compare and contrast attitudes about money in church, and where you might have come across themes or teaching in Scripture. Okay, let's come back together, and I'd like to, if possible, hear from each group. Just one reflection back from your group. We'll start at the back over here. What was one reflection from your conversation about attitudes and values about money? Oh, microphone. Thank you.
So you kind of hinted at this, well, the big thing we said is I, as the vicar, have been really reticent. I really struggle, and I'm told off constantly by my treasurers and stuff with asking for money and talking about money, and yet I also, in fact, just yesterday saw a parishioner who asked me about homosexuality in the Bible, and I said, you know, there are 600 odd references to giving your money away, and so I guess the answer is Jesus and the prophets and the Bible talk a lot about money and challenge people and are happy to enter into that conversation, and so maybe I should be more courageous about having those discussions.
Very good. Always good to influence the vicar in these things. Let's hear from the group at the front here. Anything that in particular that struck you as you were discussing?
The Bible appears to be quite contradictory in some ways, you know, turning over the tables in one story, sort of celebrating the sort of use of money and growing your talents in another. So can be quite difficult to navigate some of that, I think. But also, we were just touching then on what you said about the 90% of your money and everyday choices that we may or may not be conscious of for various reasons.
Fantastic, thank you. I don't know if you've come across the retelling of the parable of the talents. We can perhaps get into that later, the kind of anti-capitalist telling of it, which is quite interesting. Anyway, and this group at the front here, what would you like to feed back from your conversation?
I can. I was saying that I was reflecting the other day, I had never heard a sermon on telling landlords to not, you know, be unreasonable to their tenants, you know, to kind of hike up the rents, or probably in the same way, sort of employers not to, exploit their employees. So I think we can be quite reticent to talk about the imbalance in income and power that you can have over other people's income in church, even though there'll be lots of landlords sitting there, for instance.
Very interesting, thank you. That's brilliant. Thank you, everybody.
I was just going to add to that, yeah. That there is the story that Jesus tells about the labourers in the vineyard, where the men who come waiting all day and only work for an hour or whatever at the end of the day get the same money as the people who worked all day.
Yes.
And that challenges us to think about, you know, what is fair, and if you've got the money to pay someone who's only worked for you for an hour when they've been not able to get work earlier in the day, perhaps they deserve it.
Fantastic, yes, absolutely. Controversial stuff there. Okay, fantastic. We're going to dive in a bit more detail then to some Christian principles around money, which will touch on lots of the things that you've been talking about. First of all, and I'm going to mention three in good Christian tradition, 3 areas of how we can set principles or framing around money. The first set is around how we can think about money in the created order. And you might have been reflecting on some of what I'm going to say in terms of harvest and themes around stewardship and so on. Because throughout Scripture, we're reminded that everything we receive comes ultimately from God. For example, Psalm 24 says that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, and all our choices should be made to honour him. God created everything, and so in a certain sense we own nothing, neither money nor possessions. Everything we have we could even see as being on loan. And there's a concept in Catholic social teaching of the universal destination of all goods. And it's this idea that ultimately everything belongs to God and finds its purpose in its use for God's purposes. So we have from this concept of stewardship that is quite common in Christian teaching and comes up throughout Scripture, right from Genesis. We hear how humans are created in God's image to rule over creatures that move along the ground. And we hear in Genesis 2 that the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to take care of it. And we also hear that humans are instructed to be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth and subdue it. As gardeners and stewards then of creation, there's a few things we can take from that. We're created for relationship, not only with other humans, but with the whole non-human creation also. We're intended to participate fully in God's creation with some special responsibility for its well-being. And we're accountable for how we engage with the world around us. So this stewardship framing can be really helpful in starting to think about money. It can lead us to think about what God's priorities might be for how we use money. And if we're all, as people created by God, then how we use money should reflect the dignity of each of us. For example, right in the beginning of Scripture, we have the concept of Sabbath and this rhythm of rest and restoration that reflects our human dignity and purpose, and that we're not just simply economic units making or creating wealth. So that's the first set of ideas that I want to talk about. The second set of ideas is, and some of this we've touched on already, around the way that money is part of a world that might be seen as fallen or in rebellion. And this is where we have lots of these, the teachings from the prophets, focusing on the injustices of inequality in wealth, the elites who ignore the plight of the poor, who exploit people, or who are corrupt. And we have that famous teaching from Jesus about not being able to serve both God and money, or mammon, and St. Paul as well on the love of money being the root of many kinds of evil. There's some kind of side to money and its use in the economy which is connected to greed, to conflict, to dysfunction in some way. And it's that desire for more money that can be really problematic. And actually, the former Archbishop Rowan Williams has talked about wealth being just as much of a problem as poverty. And he says we have a need to liberate ourselves from a toxic and unjust situation in which we, the prosperous, are less than human. I want to just reflect a little bit on that characteristic of money as a person, as mammon, that Jesus talks about. And that gives us a sense of the influence and the power of this, almost this character, this being. And the current Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, wrote this book called Dethroning Mammon a few years ago. And he says, Mammon can deceive us into wrong attitudes and values about money, leading us to value what we can measure and believe that we can own and control that which is our wealth. So money as mammon, this kind of dysfunctional, greedy version of money, of the love of money. And we can see that in the world around us. We can see the impact of that, can't we, in terms of economic inequality and poverty, in terms of the ravaging of creation and the environmental concerns that many of us share, in terms of corruption and conflict. And money touches on so many of those issues, but often isn't surfaced in the way in which we talk about those issues or engage with them. Yes?
And I think it's important that we know, just as everyone has some power in a system, you know, we all have some money, and therefore we all have some leverages of power. But I wonder also if there's something about fear, not just greed, and this sense in which we are told that things are scarce, and people feel they have to hold on to their stuff. And I understand that as Christians we come from the place of none of it's ours anyway, but I do think insecurity and the whole ideas around scarcity rather than abundance also drive bad habits in terms of money.
Yes, absolutely. I don't think I'm talking about it so much this evening, but I will be talking a bit about it in a second in terms of a redeemed understanding of money, exactly that idea, and how do we say that in context where some people don't have very much? How do we maybe make that real as churches, and how can we look at some of the examples from the early church or from even the Old Testament? I will come on to in a minute and see if we can get into that a little bit more. Because you're right, it's not just greed, it's a dysfunctional, fearful attitude that drives an extractive approach to the world's resources. And so we have the obvious reality in the world that some people have money and some people do not, or they have very little. We live in vastly unequal times. A couple of statistics for you. An Oxfam report from last year found that the wealth of the world's 10 richest men had doubled since the COVID-19 pandemic began. And in the UK, the richest 50 families hold more wealth than the bottom half of the UK population. And this is obviously in the context of quite recent exacerbation of that inequality with the cost of living crisis, with soaring costs of the very basics for many people. So that's money in a fallen world. Then the third framing I want us to think about, which touches most relevantly on what we were just saying about abundance, is what can we take then from Christian teaching, from Scripture, about a more redemptive, a more hopeful way of thinking about and using money. And the one particular thing I wanted to touch on is two things really. The Old Testament concepts of Sabbath and Jubilee. So once every 7 years, so the Sabbath year, rather than just the pattern of Sabbath at the end in the week. The 7th year and the 50th year, 7 times 7, in Leviticus, we have this teaching. We don't know if it ever actually happened, but we have this ordained pattern of a reset of social and economic and actually environmental inequities and injustices that had built up. Debts were cancelled, slaves were released, land was restored and rested. So a really interesting vision there for how we might think differently, how we might deal with inequalities that have built up, that could help us to think about how we deal with money and possessions and their unequal distribution now. Then, of course, we have teachings about generosity to the vulnerable, also in the law in Deuteronomy, for example, giving to those who can't provide for themselves, dealing with the reality of poverty in society around us. That's then taken through to the New Testament, and we have the gospel, the Nazareth manifesto, where Jesus proclaims the year of the Lord's favour, very clearly referring back to that Jubilee moment, actually. So his kingdom is the same, building directly on those same roots. And he says, the Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. And quite often, particularly in the West, we sort of spiritualize those passages and we think about them in terms of our spiritual poverty. But, his kingdom was absolutely concerned with the restoration of economic injustice as well. And then we have the teaching that I've named this evening's talk after, where your treasure is. And often Jesus' teaching and his encounters with people highlight his approach to money and wealth. As someone said, we've got so many teachings in the Bible, in the Gospels particularly, about money. So this is in Matthew chapter 6, and it's also in Luke chapter 12. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So as I've said before, how we treat our treasure, how we can use our treasure in ways that serve God, that are aligned with what we value, with what's important to us, and how our money can then be an outworking of our approach to our faith, to the whole of our lives. And following on from Jesus, we have the patterns in the early church. So we see them taking very seriously an approach to money and resources that took a lot of this sort of teaching into account, that was really radical in its generosity, in its approach to possessions. There was this radical availability of resources, likely inspired both by the Jubilee pattern and also by Jesus' teaching, so that Paul can urge the church to excel in giving. Our desire, he says in 2 Corinthians, is not that others might be relieved while you are hard pressed, but that there might be equality. So, a whistle-stop tour of different elements of how we can think about money in the scripture and in Christian thinking, Christian tradition, and what that all might mean for us. But let's maybe start to get a little bit practical. Although I'll just pause for a minute. Is there anything people wanted to say, people think was missing, or questions you want to ask about any of that? Obviously not intended to be comprehensive, but just to give us a few frames, a few ways of thinking about money from a Christian perspective.
Yeah, there's the tradition of poverty within the church, vows of poverty taken by religious orders. I just wondered if you had anything to say about that as well.
Yeah, really important. It was recently St. Francis's Day, wasn't it? His feast day. And the Franciscans are one of those orders that have taken very seriously not just our relationship to creation, but also a rejection of wealth, a kind of intentional poverty. So I think it's a really interesting, I don't have a sort of, this is a good thing or a bad thing, but it's a very interesting way that certain groups of Christians through history have sought to respond to this challenge of money and possessions and wealth, and how we can live well together in a different way.
Yeah, I'd just say briefly in reply to that, I think that's partly the living out God's solidarity with the poor and the powerless, but also particularly with St. Francis and some of the monastic houses, it's about rejecting the influence of wealth. So if you accept money, you understand that you are somehow in debt to people with power. So there's a thing about being free because you haven't accepted somebody else's shilling.
Yeah, really good, really helpful to think about that power and influence dynamic of money that we were talking about. I often think about the difference between, on the one hand, the disciple Matthew, and on the other hand, Zacchaeus. You remember, who was up the sycamore tree waiting for Jesus. Both had encounters with Jesus. Both were tax collectors in the Roman Empire, so complicit in the oppressive system of the day, in a very financially orientated way, and responded in very different ways. Jesus calls Matthew out of his tax collector's booth, and off he goes and becomes a disciple, rejects his previous life, his previous job, follows Jesus. And that's, a complete sort of separation, pulling out, a bit like these monastic orders in a way, if you like, a separation from the system. Zacchaeus has this encounter with Jesus, gives away a huge amount of his wealth, makes restitution, says, and Jesus says salvation has come to this house today. There's an economic element to his response to Jesus, but there's no indication that he doesn't go back to work the next day in the tax collection system. And so for each of us, we all have our own response to make to the system that we're in. Some of us may be called out of it. Most of us probably aren't. We're called to recognise that we're in it. And so what? What does that mean for how then we live well as part of that system? And that's what we're going to come on to now. More practical stuff. So this is just a little diagram. What if the money that we save or spend or invest, have in the bank, as well as the money we give away, could be put to work to tackle the injustices we see in our communities and in the wider world? And there's just a few different kind of issues there that might be on your heart, whether it's modern slavery, racial injustice, homelessness, climate crisis, pollution, low wages, fuel poverty, inequality. There are so many issues confronting us as churches, as communities in the world around us. How do we use our money in ways that can make a difference to those things? And I'm going to talk about, mainly the top three, actually. I'm not going to say an awful lot about spending, because I think ethical consumerism is probably the one area where there is a bit more understanding, a bit more sort of tradition in churches of being involved in things like fair trade, but we can talk about it more if you want to. But let's start with banking. So acting justly with our banking, and there's a quote here from it's a US group actually called Sabbath Economics. Capital deposited in any financial institution is a measure of power. Who are we giving power to? Which is exactly the point we've just been making. Billions of pounds move between bank accounts every day. Banks lend to businesses around the world. How banks make their money is by lending, investing in companies. What do you know about your bank? What do you know about the ethical credentials of your bank? Because I'm sorry to say that the big high street banks are not always good news. Ethical Consumer scores HSBC, Lloyds, Barclays, NatWest, the big four British high street banks, very poorly on ethical ratings. There are historical links that they have to slavery and colonialism that have been well documented now. And also there are still around 1 million people in the UK that don't have a bank account. And some of that is because of financial exclusion, whether that's digital exclusion, whether that's poverty premium, whether it's awareness, whether it's literacy. All sorts of reasons can drive financial exclusion. And banks, the big banks, are often not doing very much about that. The thing I particularly wanted to focus on with banks, I noticed that there's some eco-church lists at the back of your church, and many churches are increasingly concerned about caring for creation and tackling the climate crisis. Have you thought about the role that banks play in fueling the climate crisis? So banks, the way that banks operate, we often think, or we don't think about banks. This is the problem, isn't it? We don't want to think about money, so our money sits in the bank and we think it sort of sits there, and it doesn't sit there. Deposits by customers are the thing that give banks leverage to do business around the world, to make loans and investments to a huge range of companies. And the mainstream banks are lending and investing to the mainstream companies. They are effectively sustaining the status quo. So if we're not thinking about where our money is, who we're banking with, we're actually helping to facilitate the economic model that exists and the harm that that's causing, particularly to the climate. And the statistic there is that the world's 60 biggest banks put over $5.5 trillion over 7 years into the fossil fuel industry, driving climate crisis and causing deadly local community impact. So banks are funding the climate crisis. And so we all need to think about that. If we want to reduce our carbon footprint, if we want to have an impact on caring for God's creation, we need to think about banking, even though it can seem a bit tenuous. So, some ideas that you might want to think about with regards to your banking. You can switch. You can switch your personal bank account. You can switch your church bank account. We have a couple of specific things which I can talk more about on individuals. We have something called the Big Bank Switch, where you can go to our website, find the information you need about bank accounts that are banks that are not investing in the fossil fuel industry, and you can switch your bank account to them. For churches, we also have a guide called the Greener, Fairer Banking Guide, so churches can switch their bank account as well, away from those big high street banks that are investing in fossil fuels. You can also think about, I don't know what the context is here in Clapham, but is there a local credit union, for example, that you could be championing and supporting, because those are often working with those people who are excluded from mainstream banking. Could you support that credit union? And also they're not invested in fossil fuels either. So a few ideas, a few thoughts about banking. Before we move on, any questions on banking in particular? Yes, Rachel.
You said poverty premium. Can you explain what that is, what that concept is, whatever?
Yes, certainly. Sorry for using jargon. So poverty premium is a concept that basically says if you are poorer, you actually end up paying more for things, and that can be for all kinds of reasons. So it may be because you live in an area where you can't access certain services in your community. It may be because you're deemed a greater credit risk, so you don't have access to the same credit that a wealthier person might have, or the same insurance products, for example, or the same housing. It may be because you haven't got a bank account, or you can't get set up with direct debit, so you end up paying on a prepaid card for your energy, for example, which is a lot more expensive. It's all those things combined that add up to a poverty premium for actually the people who are poorest having to pay most for the basic services that they need. Thank you very much. That's better than me trying to open my bottle. Any other questions on the banking question? Anything else?
Give her a mo to have a drink.
Thanks. Just about sort of changing to an ethical bank. I mean, some people might say, well, it's easier to stay with a bank that is local and has got a high street branch rather than try and transfer to a bank that isn't local or people can't get to.
Yes, so that's often what mainstream banks count on. So a couple of things to say. One is that there are a lot of people now who will do their banking online or through an app, so they don't need a branch. If a branch is important to you, some of the ethical options that we signpost to, we don't give financial advice, I should say that up front, but who we signpost to or mention have arrangements with some of the high street banks and with the post office. So even if they don't have a branch themselves on your high street, you might be able to do your banking in the post office or do your banking through a high street bank that they have a partnership with. So there are details of that. I've brought a few copies, not many because it's very much for churches really, but our Greener, Fairer Banking Guide for Churches, there's a few over by the tea and coffee, does set out, it has a little, find the right page, a little table of what services like, does this have a branch or an arrangement with a bigger bank to have access to a branch. And likewise with the Big Bank Switch, which is for individuals, you can look at those and see. You obviously will make your own decision about whether there's a local branch of that bank in your area. But then the last thing I would say is that it's not always going to be possible for you to switch or feasible for you to switch your bank account, and that's fine. What we don't want anyone to do is to feel guilty because they can't make these changes. There are still things you can do, and we need to shift these banks. We need to get them out of fossil fuels. We need to get them to change. So we have a range of actions you can take to contact your bank, suggestions for template letters you can write to ask them about their investments, to just let them know that you as an individual, you as a congregation, you as a community care about this. And that ultimately, we believe, by building a movement of people who are taking action and speaking up for change, will help to bring about, to make a difference. So there's always something you can do, even if you can't switch your bank account.
I was going to ask about the credit unions. How does one find out if there is a local credit union?
The Church of England has a network that they champion, and so you can, yeah.
So ask your vicar. And there are a number of networks of credit unions, national networks, that you can find. Wow. There are a number of sort of trade associations of credit unions, but of course you need to know what they are in the first place. We're trying to do a little bit of signposting from our website, but we haven't got lots up there yet. But yeah, is that Churches Mutual specifically, or the Church of England one? Is that Churches Mutual or a different one? Okay.
Not sure.
Okay. Yeah, so there are a couple of suggestions there. Okay, I'm going to move on to pensions. So this is a big one. Many of us contribute to a pension scheme each month. Some of us may already be drawing our pensions. Pension funds are huge drivers of economic activity in the UK. They are financing the economy. There's £3 trillion in pension funds in the UK alone. So when it comes, again, I'm particularly focused on climate action, but it could be other ethical issues that you are concerned about. It might be the arms trade, it might be something else. Some pension funds have committed to action, but there's still a long way to go. So you might not think you're an investor, but if you have a pension, you are investing effectively through that pension in something. And many of us just don't know. We haven't found out, and we don't know if our pension is shaping a greener, fairer world or not. And if we are thinking about future generations, if we are thinking about the kind of world that we want our grandchildren and great-grandchildren to inherit, then we need to be thinking about what our pensions are invested in. Yeah.
Cover this anyway, but I know that some pension funds where you can choose, select your investments. They have ethical funds, but my question to you was, is it enough to opt for the ethical fund within that pension management, or is it better to change to a fund that is only ethically investing?
Right. Yes, so if you haven't thought about it at all, I suppose what I'd say is the best thing to do is to do something. To find out, first of all, because most of us haven't done actually. If you haven't purposely opted in to an ethical fund, your pension might well be invested in sectors that cause harm, that you don't agree with, whatever those might be. They might be fossil fuels, as I say, it might be the arms trade, it might be all sorts of things. So find out. That's the number one thing. Find out how your pension's invested. You might need to do a bit of digging. You might need to find out who your pension provider is. You might need to look into your fund brochure or quarterly investment report. There will be different questions depending on your situation. You might need to ask your employer for information. There's all sorts of ways you can do it. There are online platforms. So we mentioned Nest here as just one very, very big pension provider where you can explore the companies that your pension is invested in. So that's the very first thing to find out. And you can switch. So you're right. I mean, Nest, again, I don't know if I've got the figure here. No, but there's some crazy figure that Nest has an ethical pension pot within the wider scheme, and it's something like 1%, or it's a tiny number of people with that pension are invested in the ethical pot, because most of them don't even know it exists. So that is a good thing to do if you can. If you can't, or if you really want to go further with this and find out more and try and get into an actual ethical pension provider, there are a couple of the links are on our website, and you can look up the Ethical Consumer and another site which is called Good with Money, which can signpost you to more information about ethical pension providers. I mean, that's the gold standard, I suppose, is to actually go into an ethical pension provider to find out exactly what your money is being invested in. These are, again, I'm not wanting to sort of put too much onus on the individual. Do what you can, find out, and also you can campaign for change. So Make My Money Matter is a group that we work with. They have... again, on their website, an easy action you can take to contact your pension provider to ask them. But even if you can't access that template letter, all you need to do is find out who your pension provider is and write to them and say, I'm really concerned about peace and conflict and harms to children's health and the environment. What are you doing? What are you invested in? Where can I find this information? And they have they have a duty to respond to you, and so if we can all just be more equipped and more engaged with thinking about this stuff, then we can start to make a difference. Okay, I want to give us plenty of time for more general questions and discussion, and my next area is ethical investing. So, this might be something that affects you if you've got a stocks and shares ISA, if you've got a small amount of money invested as an individual, or a large amount of money invested as an individual, or it might be something that you think about as a church, as a diocese, as perhaps you're involved in a business or a charity that has investments. There's all sorts of ways in which this might be relevant to you. So or as I say, as a pension holder. What are the values and the ethics that guide your thinking about investment? Have you been thinking about the whole kind of slew of framing that we talked about in terms of stewardship, in terms of God's priorities, in terms of how money can be corrupting and fear-mongering and powerful, and how we can redeem our use of money and be radically generous and tackle some of the injustices in our world through the use of money? Do we think about that at all in terms of our investments as churches and charities as well as individuals? As I said before, we can't give financial advice, but we do have lots of information, particularly on our website. But I want to share with you a little bit this evening as well about the kind of approach that you can take to ethical investment. So, ethical investment, also described as sustainable investment or responsible investment. You might have heard of little acronyms like ESG. There are all sorts of different ways to talk about this, and that's one of the problems, to be honest. It can be very, very confusing and difficult to work out what's going on. But we would advise that if you are thinking about investments, you can take 3 approaches. You can avoid investing in certain sectors that might be gambling, alcohol, tobacco, the arms trade, fossil fuels. That's often called negative screening. That can also cover things around divestment, which you might have come across in terms of fossil fuels, taking your money away from things that you no longer want to be invested in. I don't know if you're aware, but the Diocese of Southwark that Clapham is part of committed to divest from fossil fuels last year, to do that by the end of this year as part of a big campaign that's been running for a few years to get the Church of England and other denominations to stop investing in fossil fuel companies. So that's something you could find out more about. What else is the diocese invested in? What's its approach? How does that? What's it doing with basically ultimately the money that it has from churches and parishioners. What's going on there? What's that being used for? But anyway, that's divestment. You can engage. You can use your investments to use your voice. We actually hold very small numbers of shares of the Just Money movement, just 1 or 2 in different companies, so that we can go to their AGMs and advocate for change through being shareholders. So that's something you can do as well. You can use your voice to engage with companies and try and get them to change. Or you could do that via your pension provider or your fund manager. And the final example, so that's avoid or engage, and the last approach is to embrace. So this is where you invest positively in businesses that are doing good, and often that's called impact investing, and that's a growing area of interest. There's a lot more opportunities and options. I'm just going to mention a few examples on the slide. Oh, it hasn't come up with the right... Yes, it has. Good. Phew. So we've got... these are just examples, not recommendations or promotions of any kind, but just to let you know that there are lots of different ways now that actually as very small investors we can invest positively. FX is a platform that connects opportunities for investment in communities with small-scale investors. Energize Africa is another one. The Big Exchange is another one. And then shared interest is it's related to fair trade, but it's the kind of financing side of it. So you can have an investment account with shared interest that invests money in fair trade businesses in the Global South. And Green Pastures is a kind of a program, organisation that invests specifically in housing in social housing with a view to tackle homelessness. So there's a few examples that you can find out more about there, but there's basically to say that's all of those are in that third bucket of embracing. So things that we can do positively with our money. I think I'll pause there for a moment and just see if there are any other questions or thoughts at this stage on any of that. Yes.
So how easy is it to find these opportunities and sort of trustworthy advice?
Yeah, it's one of the problems, I would say. So we have, on our website, we signpost to some networks of financial advisors, and so you can go with a financial advisor and get their thoughts. Obviously, then, though, you've still got to work out if they've got the same sort of criteria or interests as you, so it can be complicated. The government have introduced some new labelling that's supposed to make things clearer and easier. That's coming in this autumn, really, so we're waiting to see how effective that is, because there is this whole thing of greenwashing in finance, so that you get everyone now has an ethical investment fund, and it's all ethical, and actually how can you possibly tell? So it isn't easy, I have to say, but I keep saying if you go to our website, and I apologise for those who maybe don't find that the easiest thing in the world, but our Money Makes Change hub, which is on our website, has lots of signposting to, as I say, networks of financial advisors, and to resources like Ethical Consumer and Good with Money, who can help you to do a bit of the work, but it is currently still quite hard work. We're looking at whether we can do a bit more campaigning actually in this space of trying to get clearer labelling, clearer guidance for individuals to help with this. Any more questions at this stage?
Sarah, so I've got one.
Yeah.
About redemption, really, corporate redemption in this case. There are lots and lots of examples of
companies which are heavily invested in fossil fuel type, for instance, BP comes to mind, others too, who are themselves invest because they know their future is limited. We're not going to be certainly using oil so much in 20 years' time, so they've got to move, and so they're investing in wind power or solar energy or EV charging and all kinds of examples of investments which bring them away from that. So I wonder whether you could sort of help us reflect on relative ethics, if you like. That is to say, because the notion of sort of just stopping investing in them and going to find some possibly not very profitable in terms of your pension investment, instead of encouraging them to continue on their change over the next few years.
Yeah, so it's a really thorny topic, this. So, and I think it ultimately has to be up to each of us to decide, do we think that a company can change? I mean, as Christians, we believe that no individual is beyond redemption. And yet, as sort of being wise as serpents at the same time as being innocent as doves, what do we think about some of these companies and their attempts to tell us that they are really changing their ways, that they are getting out of oil, that they are going to be, the bright green future that we all need? And it's difficult. I think one of the principles we would say is, are you in a position to have an influence? So there are some really big investors, I mean, including the Church of England, for example, Church Commissioners, Church of England Pension Board, can make a difference and are trying to, for example, at the moment with some of the mining companies or around issues around deforestation. They're in a position to, in coalition with other investors, try to actually influence those companies. For most of us, as individuals, we're probably not going to be able to influence that company through our shares, and therefore, is it more for us to think about integrity, discipleship, what is it that we want to do with our money that's in line with what's important to us? That's perhaps one principle, one way of looking at this. But different people have different views, and there are obviously also different. Every company is different, and some companies are doing more that seems to be more genuinely transformative than others. So it's, again, I would say, about equipping ourselves, educating ourselves, trying to find out and make decisions that are wise, that are informed, rather than just the main thing. If you take anything away from this evening, is just don't let your money just sit there, because it isn't just sitting there. It is doing something, and if you don't know what it's doing, it's quite likely doing something that you don't want it to do. Okay. Yeah, Rachel.
I don't know if this would fall under the giving financial advice or whatever, so tell me if it does or if you're going to cover it. But is there a sort of, you were talking about the sort of the middle one of sort of influencing, and bearing in mind you've just sort of said maybe engage, that's it, yeah, that maybe some companies won't take much notice of just little old me. I've wondered, so my main account is with a building society. Do you get a bit more influence? Because I know I get, which I frankly ignore, normally an email once a year going, we've got our AGM, please, get involved or whatever. So I know that I can do it through that. But for accounts that aren't building societies accounts, is that harder, like just because it's the way it's set up, or can you speak about that a bit?
Yes, absolutely. So building societies generally are better. They are more democratically instituted, and they're generally not, because of the way they work, they're not generally invested in, for example, fossil fuels. So they are generally better. It's quite hard to have a voice as a customer of a bank. But the proviso to all of this, I would say, is where we are trying to do things collectively. So I mentioned how we think it's important to try and build a movement of people taking action. So for example, with the big bank switch that we're running, we're saying, well, it's quite hard as an individual to see the power of switching my bank account, just little old me. But if I get together, if I sign the pledge on this campaign that's JustMoney and Operation Noah and Just Love, which is a student group, if I sign this pledge and do it collectively, they can then tell the media, they can tell the banks that all of these people are doing this together and make more of a difference. Or even if I just write to my bank and tell them that I'm switching. So there are ways of having more of an impact with our lifestyle changes, even if it's just us on our own, and then there are ways of doing it collectively with others that can make more of a difference as well. So I hope that helps a bit. I'm conscious of time, so I will just say a tiny bit. As I say, I'm not going to talk a lot about spending, but if people have questions, do feel free to ask me. So again, obviously, the way we spend money also connects us to our global neighbours and our local neighbours. What are the values that are at the heart of our spending choices? And again, this can get complicated, can't it? Is it that we want to spend our money locally in the community that we live in? Or is it that we want to support fair trade businesses in different parts of the world? And that's choices that we have to make, and they're not straightforward. But anyway, we need to think about that. We need to think about caring for creation. That might mean buying less. Caring for global neighbours and local neighbours too with our spending. And I can say more about, in particular, we help churches and organisations think about their buying. So we've got a guide to an ethical procurement policy for your church that you can help think through all the different things that you might buy. Are you, for example, paying your cleaners a living wage? Are you thinking about the taxes that the businesses you buy from pay? There's something called the fair tax mark, which is a bit like the fair trade mark for businesses that are paying their taxes fairly and responsibly. There's all sorts of labelling schemes and things, and again, it's about navigating and working out what's important to you, and then how do you make those choices, both as individual consumers, but also as churches. So I will just wanted to give this quote to kind of finish. Every step towards more just practices matters. Every step towards the service of God is a step away from the service of money. We shouldn't get complacent with this kind of impact if we're indeed capable of more, but neither should we think that small impacts don't matter. The inbreaking of God's kingdom is already happening, and it is not yet complete. Whilst we must imagine grand prophetic visions of what could be, we must do the patient and persistent work of making those visions real. We can always trust that God does much with little. We're never alone in this work. So hopefully that's a bit of encouragement to you. And I just want us to spend a few minutes in the final little bit of discussion, just thinking together, perhaps go into those small groups, the 3 groups that you were in earlier. What are you already doing to make a change with your money? What have you seen others do that could serve as an inspiration? And what would help you to take the next step? What's the block, or what's the thing that you need to take the next step? Okay, so if you can turn into those small groups once more and just spend a few minutes, what are you already doing? Or what have you seen others do? And what would help you take the next step? Okay, let's come back together. Would anyone like to share? I'll come to this group first. Is there anything that you were particularly reflecting on in terms of what you've already done, what you've seen others do, or what would help you take the next step?
I was saying that we're fortunate enough, Christopher and me, to have some money to invest. And we divide it sort of not quite equally, but we have our own pots. And it was a few years ago now that I did transform for everything of mine into what we were assured was ethical investment. And at the end of that first year, I had made more money than he had. So it is an encouragement that we can now make money out of ethical investing.
That's great to hear. The ethical fund
I made a better percentage increase than Chris did because I had invested ethically.
Excellent. And that can be the case. Obviously, it can also not be the case. Anyone in the front group here that was... Anything you want to share? No? And further back?
There are companies that do ethical investing, don't they? So it's a question of just looking at on the internet, I presume.
Do you mean fund managers that will...
Yeah.
Yes, there are. And they have started... some of them... there haven't been lots of companies that do products for individual customers, but they are starting to now a bit.
Are they?
Yes. Yeah. So, yes, you can look around for those as well. Or you can look, as I say, for financial advisors. Or you can look, I mean, the basic level is like a stocks and shares ISA, and some of the ethical banks like Triodos, for example, have that. That's a very simple way to do things at a very basic level with a small amount of investment.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm just listening in on Catherine's. So I have a self-select pension, and I used chose the ethical investment. But I was listening to Catherine, and she had said that her decision, which I feel I need to make as well, is change my bank, because I'm with NatWest, and I just saw they were one of the worst. And I thought, okay, right, I need to do something about that. But would also just say that, if we talked more about this stuff, we do influence one another, because I know with, organic and ethical food, I've been influenced by other people, and then I've said, oh, I use this because so-and-so does, and then it is a contagious thing when people realise it's an option. And it gives them a sense that they have some agency and that they can make a difference, which I think is always good to encourage people.
Absolutely, that's right. And I think that switching your bank account is something that, most of us, maybe opened a bank account when we had one open for us by our parents or when we were a student, and then that's it. You never change. And most of the high street banks, all of the high street banks depend on that kind of lethargy and apathy. And actually, it's pretty easy for an individual to switch. There's the current account switch guarantee that takes all your kind of standing orders and direct debits over for you. I mean, obviously, things don't always go smoothly, but most of the time with individuals, they go well. And that's, if we can talk to one another and share stories of how that's happened and how we can switch and do things, whether it's switch your bank account, looking into your pension provider, thinking about your investments, or how you spend your money, they're all ways that we can, as you say, encourage one another. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so my final slide then is just a few links and resources. Our website is justmoney.org.uk. There's a few, as well as the Greener Fairer Banking Guide, which is really aimed at churches. There are a few general leaflets on the table by the tea and coffee as well, if you want to just pick up a little bit of information about us that's printed. Our Money Makes Change hub is all the things that I've been talking about this evening on the website, and lots more. So lots of signposting on all of these areas, so you can really get stuck into that. And there are, prayer and Bible resources as well there. And we have something called a small group resource, which you could look at. I don't know if you do Lent groups or study groups or home groups. There are all sorts of ways you could use that as a congregation to go through some of this stuff in a bit more detail if you wanted to. As I said right at the beginning, we also do a number of campaigns with the new Parliament. We've got one at the moment that's just asking people to contact their MP, their newly elected or re-elected MP, and say hello, welcome, and also what are you going to do to help shape a fairer, greener economy. And our particular concerns there are around a green investment for a green economy, an inclusive financial system, and a change to the tax system to have more taxes on wealth so as to redress the balance in terms of wealth inequality that I was talking about. We also finally have something called JustMoney Champions, which is a scheme if you're particularly keen and want to get involved and get some training, get some resources, meet some like-minded people who are also activists in this space. We're resourcing JustMoney Champions, so do ask me if you'd like to find out more. And yeah, I'll leave it there, and we can have any final questions or thoughts or reflections as we finish in the next few minutes.
Anyone questions? Just a reminder as well, do scribble down any thoughts you have for further Beyond Sundays or feedback or anything like that, and hand it to me, by the way. Deafening silence. I was going to ask quickly, can you tell us how you sort of came to be where you are in Just Money and about Just Money movement a little bit?
I realise I didn't say very much about Just Money movement. So I have been the director for about 3.5 years now of the Just Money movement, which is an organisation that's actually been around for many decades, but with a different name. It was called the Ecumenical Council for Corporate Responsibility, which is why we changed the name. So we've only been Just Money movement for 2 years. But yeah, historically we've done a lot of that kind of shareholder engagement and AGM activism that I was talking about. Then we moved into more of this sort of ethical finance education and also campaigning on tax. My background is in advocacy and campaigning on economic justice issues, particularly globally around the Jubilee debt campaign, tax justice campaigns, those sorts of economic issues at the international level. And also on climate, but particularly finance for climate for renewables in sub-Saharan Africa. So I've worked for a range of charities and campaigning organisations, and came to Just Money, as I say, about 3 or 4 years ago. So we're a team, there's about 5 of us. We are remote based, so I'm in North London, so I just came all the way down on the Northern Line today, but other people are up in Sheffield and in the Midlands and different parts of England, I should say. And we are basically trying to build a movement of people using our education resources, whether those are more sort of doing the biblical and Christian reflection or the more practical side of things, or getting involved in our campaigning on banking and greener banking, fairer banking, and on tax justice. We engage with churches across the denominations. We're particularly we're affiliated to Churches Together in England, so we have that kind of ecumenicalness in our essence.
Great, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I got a lot out of that. Thank you for coming out this evening. I've got you a little something or two to say thank you for coming.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you all. Hope you've enjoyed this.
Really appreciate it, and we've got it recorded so you can listen back on YouTube. I'm sure that will magically appear on the website. Nick will send me a link and we'll work it out. Thank you very much, Nick, for doing sound as well. It's really helpful, and sorting out the projector. I don't have any more booked yet, as I say. Hopefully you'll be giving me some nice ideas, but we'll let you know. I think that was all I was going to say.
So I was going to say thank you to Rachel, but also, this was just brilliant. it's given us so much food for thought. I think there are loads more people who would be really interested to hear what you have to say. And as I sat there, I thought, I'm going to see if they'll come to our churches together. So I feel that we will definitely be spreading the word, and we'll want to, get this out there and get more people engaged.
Are you part of Churches Together in South London? So I'm speaking at the Churches Together in South London, but on Zoom in November. So I'll send Rachel the details.
Please do, because I think we will
be a similar
want
thing
to encourage other people to attend that.